I yesterday spoke to a bunch of college, high school kids. Tomorrow I'm going to speak to a bunch of Chinese exchange students for 4 hours talking about science. And I always like to start by saying one of the most accurate and profound statements in the entire history of mankind is the very first verse of the Bible. Long before anybody knew anything about modern science, it starts with, in the beginning, that is time, God created the heavens. That's the Hebrew word for like a template, an empty canvas, space in essence, and earth, which is their concept of matter. Time, space, and matter are named in the very first verse of the Bible. But it doesn't leave us with the option of believing it all just made itself. It said God created. There had to be something that made time, that made space, that made matter. Now this is written 3,500 years ago. And I think Moses got those concepts from previous people, who got it from previous people. That goes all the way back to Adam and on, and the revelation from God. Now, lest we think we are free just to interpret the world around us any way we want, I just want to read a couple verses out of Romans 1. This is Romans 1, starting with verse 19. It says, now just listen. I specifically didn't put it up here because sometimes it's distracting to read. I want you to just listen to what God's Word actually says. That which may be known of God is manifest to everyone. Manifest meaning obvious. What we can know about God is obvious to everyone. For God has shown it to them. Now it's talking about everybody on the planet, not just people in universities, not just people in Africa, not just people in Europe, everybody. What can be known about God is obvious. For the invisible things of God, Him, have been known from the creation of the world, being clearly seen from the things that have been made, even God's power in His very nature, His Godhead. So they are without excuse. So why is everybody on this planet without excuse for believing in God? What's it say? Because of what He has made. Nobody can look at creation and say, oh, God, I would have worshipped you if I'd only known. Because God said it is obvious to every human being by studying creation. You understand what it's saying? It means you can't logically pretend creation made itself. Because if we could, we'd have an excuse not to believe in God. That directly contradicts what God has told us. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If God has made it so obvious that creation couldn't have made itself, how can incredibly intelligent people not get it? You understand? Physicists aren't stupid. Geologists aren't stupid. Biologists, biochemists, teachers, educators, museum curators, they are not stupid people. And yet, increasingly, everywhere we look, more and more and more people are coming to the conclusion, you can explain everything without God. It just all made itself. Why? How can that be when God's Word tells us the opposite is true? That's what we're going to explore. How can people be blind to the obvious? Now, I've been studying this for 30 years. I've been teaching on it even while I was working it down. By the way, I look around and I see old friends and folks that I love, and this is my 5th time here. But I see about half people I don't recognize, which is really cool. But for those who don't know me, my background is a research leader. I worked for 30 years at Dow Chemical. I understand very well what science can do and what science can't do, what it can prove and what it can't prove. And I've been studying it from this perspective for that long. But I came out of college believing everything made itself because I've been trained to think that way. We just lost our projector. Okay. I'm moving my mouse and it's not doing anything. Okay, well, while he's doing that, I'll just kind of lay out. So I've written 6 books. I've spoken to probably 30,000 people. Every year I give away about 8,000 books to students, prisoners, teachers, pastors, churches, and so on. All the money that flows into this nonprofit ministry I started flows back out as resources. I price all my materials free for $20, which is really about $1 more than they cost me to make, so people can afford to give them away. That's the goal, to impact the thinking of the people around us and kind of line it up with a biblical viewpoint. About a year ago, I thought less and less and less and less people even read, especially the young people. It's like their Palm Pilot. You're not a Palm Pilot, but their phone is their, it's their source of information. And the videos are really, really, really powerful. So I basically poured all my effort and money in this last year into producing a 12-week curriculum that can be shown in churches, it can be shown in small groups, it can be shown to homeschool kids, it can be shown to youth groups. And I want to make it really visual. So I've been going to Mount Rushmore and Lake Superior and Grand Canyon and Bryan and Zeiss and Bryce and so on, and filming a creation. Yeah, there really is a creator behind thing. The Bible can be trusted viewpoint. And the first session is always about why it matters. The middle 30 minutes is some teaching from some area of science. The wrap up is how can intelligent people not see this obvious stuff? And I want the audience is your typical Christian that thinks, yeah, the Bible contains a bunch of truths, and yeah, I believe in God, and Jesus may even be my Savior, but you really can't trust it. It's just one of many, many, many ancient documents. It really doesn't mean what it says. Modern science has proven it wrong. And I just want you to watch the intro of the quality of this and think about how it could just change people's perceptions. Because of connecting science with God's Word, and that's powerful. When connecting history to God's Word, and that's powerful. And the first of the 12 was totally done. They cost about $5,000 each to produce these, and I don't ever expect to get the money back, but that's not the goal. But I've got one for everybody, every family. Please take one. I think you'll love it, because it's not somebody standing and lecture, even like tonight. It's blended with all sorts of animation and video clips and historical clips and all sorts of, when I'm talking about a trilobite, doesn't come with a tag, tag attached. There's no label. Up pops this little price tag that's dangling back and forth. And it's just fun to watch. So watch the intro and think about the impact on folks in other churches, family members that go to other churches, and how it could help so many people to see a biblical perspective of reality for the first time in many cases. So this is just the intro you're about to see. I'm going to hit the lights as I'm rolling different little video clips. But without all the animation and stuff, it's going to be just boring old me standing there lecturing. But let's just walk on through this. No matter what group I'm talking to, I don't care if it's a bunch of college professors, and I have talked to them, or a bunch of youth group teenagers who can't seem to hold a thought in their head for more than 10 seconds. I just kind of lay things out in a very simple, easy to understand way. And I help them to understand, as we look at the world around us and the majesty of the biological world and the rock layers and the universe and the stars, there are only two possibilities to explain it. If you think of all that, the entire universe is this box, and bear with me if you've been in my lectures before and you've heard this, because I know there's folks that haven't. And if you look inside the box and you find all these jewels, it's a jewelry box with finely crafted, bracelets and necklaces and beads and colors. I mean, think of those as the animals, the whales, the rainforest, the giraffes, all this complexity of life. Either the box made itself and everything in the box made itself, or the box has a box maker. I mean, that is the only two big category possibilities. Now, there's folks that'll say, well, you know what? There's a third category. Evolution made everything, but God made the universe by means of and with the process of evolution that made everything else. Listen to what you're saying or thinking. It's still saying one thing turned into another, and gas turned into stars, and stars turned into planets, and planets, the chemicals came alive, and one life form turned into another, that eventually turned into us. It's still saying the box made itself. You're just kind of throwing with lip service the idea God started it all. And if that's true, there is absolutely no evidence from studying creation that God exists, because it all made itself. So where's the evidence for God? You understand the contradiction? It's just a subset of wanting to believe in God and still believing the box made itself. But the box made itself. So it's one or the other. Now logically, it's really, really obvious with the box. And what I'm about to spend the next 45 minutes, hour talking about is God has made it just as obvious that he's the one who made life. He's the one who created stars. He's the one that made time, space, and matter, because the very laws of science show us that's the best option. Now, one more just bit of background. Science is really, really, really a good, useful tool for understanding how the universe operates. And it does operate by natural laws, without a doubt. It's how we've been able to create electronics and electricity and motors and, put man on the moon and computers and everything else. Because we understand how it operates, use it to our advantage to create these things. But what science does not do is explain the origin of these things. Because you can't go back in time. And God's Word gives us a phenomenal model to understand biology, to understand geology, to understand history, to understand the nature of things. And if we leave it out, we're going to misinterpret it because we've left out what is actually the truth. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. Now, the main perspective I want you to walk away with tonight is not just a bunch more facts about here's some facts that fit creation, here's some facts that fit the Bible. Because honestly, if I do that in a student classroom, they're going to hear for the next year a bunch of supposed facts that contradict the Bible, and just the volume of it will overwhelm it. I want you to walk away with a perspective of how people are being trained to think, how they're being trained to interpret everything. And it's not just the schools, it's not just the museums, it's not just the textbooks, it's not just the media. It is the entertainment culture of our day. And I run together just about a 1-minute montage of multi-trillion-dollar, if you added them all together, movies that have been seen by hundreds of millions of people, starting with, in the 70s up into the 80s, Carl Sagan produced a series that was shown in essentially every science classroom in the country called Cosmos. It's recently been reproduced. And I want you to just think about the impact of what you're about to hear on the thinking of people as this is constantly fed to them, this perspective. The Cosmos is $1 billion mega movies seen by 500 million people at times. X-Men and Mission to Mars and Spider-Man movies. And now think about what they're doing. They're training everybody watching them to think in only one possible way. Millions of years, billions of years, evolution's a fact. Stated over and over, and that's just a teeny little sampling. When I talk to kids, the first thing I help them understand is every word that comes out of every mouth when you're watching a movie is written by some scriptwriter with a worldview to promote his beliefs and wants you to get to believe it. Doesn't make it true. But the fact that that agrees with what they're hearing in the textbooks and the museums and everywhere they go, it has an enormous impact. And at the end, I'm going to show you how enormous. And it's mind-boggling what it can do. One of the best illustrations, and by the way, I got to touch on a couple things. One of those movies said, and we've all heard it hundreds of times, chimpanzee DNA is 97, 98% identical to human DNA. That statement was first coined back in the 70s before we had any clue about the DNA. They compared one molecule and repeated it over and over and over and over again until it got locked into the textbooks and the minds. We've now totally decoded chimpanzee DNA, totally decoded human DNA, 10-year project costing hundreds of millions of dollars. If you just line them up like you line up the letters of a book, there are 1 billion differences, 30% difference. It would be like taking a book, permanently, randomly changing a letter at a time, a third of the book, and expecting the book to not only be readable, but those functions maintain their function and usefulness. And then say, this proves the one book came from the other. It's a lie. It's a lie. And they picked the music of Bach to say hydrogen gas turned into us. I'll come back to that in a second. Anybody know what Bach signed every sheet of music he wrote? Tell me.
To the glory of God.
To the glory of God, I believe alone. To the glory of God alone.
There's only Deo Gloria.
Yes.
To God alone be the
To
glory.
God alone be the glory. I rearranged it, okay? But that's the music they picked to pretend hydrogen gas turned into us. In other words, God is irrelevant. That's not an accident.
No.
That is a slam on a Christian worldview and viewpoint. Now, one last clip, and then I'm going to get into the science of all this. Ran across this about a year ago, and it's just profound in what it shows. It seems to have nothing to do with this subject. It's about an engineer who the welders in his shop decided to trick him by making a bicycle a little different than a normal bicycle and challenging him to ride it. But I want you to watch this, and I'm going to talk about the implications in a second. And I'm told there's another light switch over here. So just watch this clip. It's really fascinating.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back.
All a lie.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. No one's ever seen it happen. And if they're that wrong about that, why do we believe them when they say life formed itself? One animal turned to another. The DNA code wrote itself. There's been billions of years. See, it's all, we're conditioned and trained that way. The children are trained to think that way. Once they think that way, they become the teachers. They even more strongly promoted the next generation. It becomes locked into the only possible way to ride the bike. But how do you know it's true? It's a really valid question because it violates the very laws of science. And by the way, what's their solution? Dark matter, dark energy. You hear about it all the time. It's a mathematical concept that if you can pretend 95% of all matter and all energy in the universe is invisible, unseeable, untestable, unknowable, then somehow you can mathematically pretend it forces the gas inward to form a star. Is that science or is that faith? It's fantasy. It's faith. Because you can't test it, you can't see it, you can't even know it's there. Even if it was right in front of us, you wouldn't know it because it's invisible.
No, it's not faith, it's imaginings of a deluded mind.
Well, let's not be insulting about deluded, but it's certain. Well, deluded just means they've been led to believe something's not true.
Yeah.
So in a way that
I'm
is
not doubting
honest.
in that which one has hope.
Yeah. Well, let me move on because I don't want to keep you indefinitely. I want to spend about 5 minutes on each of these. Let's look at the biological sciences with a couple examples. And I picked this one just because it's fun. Okay. God put incredible variety into the different kinds of creatures he made, all right? And I'm going to just pick one. It's called the leafhopper. There's about 20,000 species. Doesn't mean God instantly made 20,000 kinds at the moment of creation. He just put the complexity in there so it could vary and fit different environmental niches, but they're clearly identified as the same kind of creature. I like to call this guy the Olympic athlete of insects on steroids, okay? Because there's nothing out there that jumps like he does. When he takes off as a young nymph, before he's at full size and it slows him down, he jumps and accelerates at its peak at 100 times the acceleration of gravity. Now, just to put it in perspective, a test pilot, when he's banking in a jet airplane and he's chasing another airplane, when he hits about 10 G-forces, 10 times faster than a ball would drop if you let go of it, the blood starts to drain from his face and he's in danger of blacking out. So they put him in pressure suits to shove the blood back up into his extremities. And they have to test these guys and girls to make sure they can handle it. So they put them in these centrifuges that spin around faster and faster and faster. I want to show you a picture of what 10 G-forces looks like. Okay, that's 10 G's on the human face. This little insect, he takes off 10 times faster than that at 100 G's. So it's kind of cool, but scientists were wondering about this and they started testing a nerve. They know how fast the signal would go from his brain to his legs. So the little grasshopper guy, he's walking along going dum 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 dum, and his brain says, jump. The signal goes down his back and it splits to go to both legs, but his legs react so fast that signal can't reach both legs fast enough for both of them to move at exactly the same moment. Now what do you think is going to happen when our little leafhopper gets the signal to jump and one of his legs starts moving faster than the other, 100 times faster than a ball drops? What do you think is going to happen? Think he's going to go straight? No? What direction do you think he's going to go?
One way or the other.
The one that didn't get the
Sideways.
message.
His little insect brain is going to go bang into the side of the tree, and his brains are going to go flying all over the forest, and he's going to be the end of the leafhopper. Now, my opinion is, I think God wanted to make a really cool creature so we would know it couldn't just have made itself. And scientists started to look into this guy to figure out how does he keep his legs moving in perfect unison. So they kind of dissected the guys and they did these electron microscope pictures. Now get ready for this. This is just so cool if you've never seen it. Now I'm an engineer, so I just get off on things like this, like machine parts and stuff. I want to show you what they found inside of this little leaf hopper after studying it for years. You ready? All right, gotta feel the suspense. This is what they found. Deep inside the insect. I mean, our jaws ought to drop. Now think about how every school child in public America is trained to think and ride their bike. Evolution's a fact. Evolution's a fact. Millions of years, billions of years, one animal must have turned into another. How could something that wasn't a gear, that perfectly interlocked with another gear, have turned into that set of gears? This is how evolution's supposed to work. You had some creature that didn't have these gears, some other insect. It might have had just a couple little round blobs, or I even show a couple tumors or rocks or something. And the only option evolution has to explain it are random changes to the programming, the DNA code of that creature. It would literally be like me walking into a machine shop, best analogy I can think of, taking something that's not a gear and hitting it with a hammer. And then I hit it with a hammer again. I hit it with a hammer again. I hit it, I hit it, I hit it. Thousands of times, hundreds of years, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. I'm hitting this thing, I'm hitting this thing. Is it ever going to turn into a gear?
No.
It's inconceivable. It is literally absurd to believe something that wasn't a gear could turn into two perfectly intermeshing gears. One has to be right hand, one has to be left hand. They have to be controlled by muscles and nerves and ligaments attached to everything, and the brain's got to know what to do with them. Because if you just had one gear, not the other, it would lock up. That creature would be a dead end. It wouldn't even evolve further. If they weren't right and left handed, it wouldn't work. If they weren't perfectly spaced, it wouldn't work. A part of a gear is a detriment. You can never get there a step at a time. Now, I think that is absolutely obvious. Yes?
Is it also true that those gears have to be pretty strong? Because if one leg is ahead of the other, then that
All
one
of
leg
the above.
has to propel the other leg, and then those teeth got to be strong.
And you could probably think of 100 more issues. It all has to be there or it wouldn't work. So it's really kind of obvious. God created incredibly complex animals, and it's the best possible explanation. So why can't biochemists, biologists, and so on see this? Now, one more example. I just love this. Here's a little fish, okay? It's called the, hang on a second. Hey, I'll have the name here in a second. It's in one of my newsletters. It's found in Hawaii. It's got a little Hawaiian name. I'm terrible at Hawaiian pronunciation. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, the opopu. The opopu fish. Now here's the life cycle of the opopu fish. It lays eggs up here at the top of a waterfall. It is only found one place in the entire world. No other place have we found this fish. Lays these eggs up at the top of the waterfall. The eggs hatch and they release, and then the little juvenile fish get flushed down the waterfall and end up in the ocean. And they take about 8 months to mature into little fish. Then the only place in the world these fish can reproduce is back up at the top of the waterfall where the male and the female fertilize each other and lay the eggs. And then they get flushed downstream, and in order to have the next generation, they've got to get back up to the top of the waterfall. Okay, that's the life cycle. Fact. They know this. Now let me show you the waterfall. That's the waterfall. That fish has to swim 440 feet upstream in that waterfall, or it can't have another generation. How's that going to happen? It turns out this fish forms a suction cup with its front fins. Only fish we know that does this. It attaches a suction cup, shoves itself forward. Attaches the suction cup, shoves itself forward. Attaches the suction cup, shoves itself forward. It's been clocked at moving about a foot a minute, up 440 feet up the waterfall to where it can reproduce. Now, how do you produce a fish that doesn't have a suction cup so it is able to climb that waterfall? It would have died long before it had the suction cup. How do you get there? How do you get from one to the other? How does it know it has to go to the top? Why would it ever want to go to the top? See, it's either all there or none of it works. And it's the end of the evolutionary development. How do you do it? It climbs up the rock. It forms its fins as a suction cup and climbs up the rock. It's the only known example of this. Isn't it amazing? See, I literally think, you can believe what you want, God made things in a certain way so we would know there's a creator behind it. And it's just astounding. It's astounding what we find out there. That's just two
The
examples.
fish also has to survive the shock of going from salt water to fresh.
Yeah, it has to have that ability. Mark, you're wonderful because you keep adding these more and more layers of things that have to happen.
Both ways.
Both ways. Both ways, back and forth. Each time. Each generation. It all has to be built in. So how do you do it a step at a time? Either it has this ability or it doesn't. It doesn't survive if it doesn't. Geology. Bottom line is the flood. Okay. Once again, either we're going to take the Bible as our model and take it seriously, or we're going to misinterpret things. And just, I want you to bear with me and close your eyes and pretend you're reading any book other than the Bible and it's telling you something. Okay? And listen, just listen. Okay? The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all of the high hills that were under the entire heaven were covered. 25 feet upward, 15 cubits upward, the waters prevailed, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved upon the earth, all of the birds, all the cattle, all the beasts, every creeping thing that creeped upon the earth, and every man died. All whose nostrils were the breath of life, all that was on dry land died. And every living substance, that's every plant, every tree, every living substance was destroyed which was on the face of the ground. And it repeats, both the men and the cattle and the creeping things and the birds of the heaven, they were destroyed from the earth. And only Noah remained alive and those with him on the ark. And these flood waters prevailed for 150 days. Now, how many think that's describing a little local flood in the Mesopotamia River Valley? You see how God goes out of his way to make sure we couldn't possibly get it wrong? Because he knew thousands of years in the future, people were going to invent this story that all these rock layers, all these fossils, everything we dig out of the earth are there because of millions of years of slow, gradual sedimentation in order to pretend God doesn't judge sin and there's never been a flood upon this earth. That's where we're at. That's where we're at today. But it's the exact opposite of what we just read. See, if you misinterpret the fact there's been a flood, you're going to misinterpret how fast rock layers lay down. You're going to misinterpret the fossils we find in the rock layers. You're going to misinterpret the coal seams. Of this series of 10 weeks, I'm probably going to spend 6 weeks talking about the worldwide flood and the evidence that it really did happen from science, from observation. Because it is a real event, and if you leave it out of your thinking, you're trained to ride your bicycle, leaving out reality, you're going to become blind to that reality. Now, I'm going to go through this quick. What we've done since about 150, 200 years ago, we've looked at the rock layers, we find sea creatures down deep, we find coal seams further up, we find land animals further up. We line up the animals and pretend one turned into another. Nobody has a time machine. Nobody's seen this happen. There are enormous gaps between, I mean, they even say dinosaurs turn into birds. A dinosaur would be a horrible dinosaur with long extended fingers and arms long before it would be a good bird. It would go extinct. Its entire respiratory system has to change. And we've never seen half and half. And that happens between all these major animal groups. But there's another explanation. During what I just read, there was enormous land movement. There would have been rapid continental movement. There would have been enormous volcanism. There would have been rapid spreading apart of the continents. And sediment would have been pulverized. And the things deepest in the early oceans would have been buried furthest down. Trilobites lived at the bottom of the ocean. Clams, coral lived at the bottom of the ocean. They're heavy, you would expect them to be furthest down. Fish, more mobile things, would have been buried further up. Land animals and huge floating mats of vegetation further up. They're not older, they're just buried at a different point during what was I just described as a world-covering flood. See, that's not complex. None of this is rocket science. Everybody has the same rocks, the same fossils. It's just how you're going to interpret them. You're going to interpret them that leaves out what God, through his holy word, has told us, or you're going to interpret it using what he's told us. And guaranteed you're going to come to different interpretations. Now, I want to show you a 2-minute clip of the flood that happened in Japan in 2011. There was a earthquake in the Pacific Ocean. The ocean dropped 6 feet across about a 200-foot or so range. I think those are the numbers. It caused a tidal wave that slammed into Japan and a lot of the eastern shore of the Asian area. But in many places it raised the water level about 20 feet, including what I'm about to show you. It's about a 20-feet rise in ocean level. Now, if you were to smooth, and again, I know some of you have heard this, but some of you haven't. If you were to smooth off the earth and the oceans weren't so deep, which would have sunk down at the end of the flood, and the mountains weren't so high, and they were formed during the flood, Mount Everest has sedimentary rock with seashells 28,000 feet above sea level. It was formed underwater. And as the flood ended, the continents, by various mechanisms, rose, the ocean basins dropped. But if it was all smooth, there's enough water on this planet to cover the entire globe 8,000 feet deep. 8,000 feet of water on this globe. It's not a matter of lack of water or where it went. It's why is there so much water, and how did it get where it got today? And what would it do if thousands of feet of water were flowing? Now let me show you what 20 feet of water will do as you watch this little video. Breakdown experiments don't allow for the tissue to be there. Do you understand what she's saying? I have been trained to ride my bike in this way. Millions of years, billions of years, it's reality. She's willing to throw out everything she knows about science, everything she knows about testing, everything she knows about every experiment ever done to hang on to the millions and billions of years time frame. Because that is her framework of reality. And she can't even see any other option, even when it's right in front of her face. But if those dinosaurs were buried during Noah's flood, about 4,500 or so years ago, there's every reason you'd still find tissue. We now have at least 12 different documented examples of soft tissue found inside of dinosaurs. And during Q&A, we'll talk about the latest attempts to try to explain all that away. But I want to go on with the last example before I wrap up. Smithsonian Institution display. Proof that man has come from apes. They show sloped, really small brain creatures and a little bigger brain creatures and less of a slope, and eventually turning into fully modern human beings. Presented as a fact in the textbooks in the schools, wherever. And it looks really, really convincing. Now, if you look at the difference between those two, and you don't even see the size difference, because they kind of make them look all the same size to promote their story. This one's down around 300 to 500 cc's. This one's up around 17 to 1800 cc's. So this is 3 to 4 times bigger than that one. But you don't see that in the displays. But, you know, they do look kind of similar in structure, and you can understand how people could be convinced of that when they're just shown that. Even very intelligent people. See, there's not a big conspiracy. It's not like this a bunch of scientists trying to hide the truth. They've just been trained to interpret things in a certain way. And it's like this. Now suppose I'm a geologist, and I'm digging down in the rock layers, or a paleontologist who studies fossils, and I find this critter, okay? And he's way down deep in the rock layers, and he looks like a really vicious critter, and if I'm the first one to find him, I get to name him, which is kind of cool. Some of them name him after themselves in Latin names. And I think, he must have been a meteor, because look at those vicious teeth. Well, you know what? Panda bears look like they have teeth even more vicious than this, and they've never eaten a scrap of meat in their life. They eat bamboo. So it's all interpretation. We don't know. Nobody has a time machine. It's interpretation. But then I keep digging, and suppose I find this guy. Now you'll notice they look pretty similar. Like this is just a baby, but it's not. I found a bunch of them, and I know he's fully grown. So how do I explain him? He's further up in the rocks. Well, I've been trained to think like this. This one had babes, pups or whatever, and they had offspring, and then they had another set of offspring, and maybe some of them were smaller, and they mated with others that are smaller, and mated with others that are smaller. And if I found this with a bunch of trees, the smaller ones could hide behind the trees better. So the fact they're smaller might have given them an advantage. So they repopulated a whole area with a completely new species or type of animal. One evolved into the other. And it'll be presented that way in various ways, shapes, and forms in textbooks. And it's going to make sense to the student.
Speculation.
But then suppose I find this one. Now you'll notice this one now has a bigger brain. Its forehead is getting taller. Okay? Look at this kind of dumb, sloped forehead critter compared to this big, steep forehead critter. And he has this big jaw that's sticking out. How do I explain him? Well, maybe, and I'll even say maybe as his jaw got longer, he could dig underneath the trees and roots better. And it gave him an advantage. And the longer his jaw, the better he could dig. And this one, or this one, evolved into that one. Over lots and lots of generations and hundreds of thousands and millions of years, we turned into a totally different looking creature. I mean, they're looking very, very different at this point. But then I find I am super excited. I find the Einstein of these kind of creatures. I find this guy. Now it turns out he has about the same number of teeth and the same sort of pattern, but look how tall his forehead is. I mean, the difference between this and that ape turning into a person is enormous. There's way more difference. And his brain, compared to his body, is way bigger compared to this guy's brain to body ratio. So he must be smarter. And I tell myself, he's got to be smarter. The guy's puny. He's the shrimp of the animal kingdom. But he's got this big brain and it allows him to survive. You see what I've done? I don't have a time machine. I don't know. I've just taken what I've been taught, evolution's a fact, millions of years, and I've applied it to what I've found. And I've come to a conclusion based on my starting assumptions. But it turns out they're all wrong. See, the first guy was a gray wolf, and every geneticist on the planet knows every single canine on Earth came from the DNA code that was already in the gray wolf. Whether it's a dachshund, whether it's a Irish setter, whether it's a wolfhound, Saint Bernard, all of that information for that kind of dog was already in the wolf. It was just sorted out and sorted out and sorted out, okay? The second one I showed you was a fox. The fox, the wolf had pups, certain of them survived better in other natural environments, and you got a subset of the wolf, which was called the fox. And it can be traced right back again. See, this isn't evolution. This is like having a book with all sorts of possible variety and just grabbing certain parts of that book. It doesn't explain where all the variety came from to begin with. You're just getting subsets of what was already there. The third one was a bulldog. Dig underneath trees and rocks to survive better. He wouldn't survive worth beans out there in the forest with a wolf. And the last one, the Einstein of the animal kingdom, is a stupid little chihuahua. See, it's just all that variety was in the wolves. Now think about this. There's way more difference between this critter and that critter than between the skulls of the ape and us. And yet, we're taught what we know had nothing to do with evolution. Dogs, chihuahuas, wolf, foxes, they were all in the wolf to begin with. There's a billion differences between us and apes. There's hardly any differences, insignificant differences between all these animals. It's crazy to believe that one animal can turn into a completely different kind of animal. So how can people be so blind? Wrap up. This is the quote by the man who's called the father of modern psychology. The first man ever to teach psychology at Harvard University in the 1800s. His name was Dr. William James. After a lifetime of study, here's his conclusion about the human brain. There is nothing too absurd to be believed if you simply repeat it often enough. We've all seen this. How do you know what you've been taught to believe is true? Let the world around us observe it and let it, and start with God's Word. Now, if we as Christians teach the Bible, doesn't even mean what it says at the very beginning, doesn't mean what it says about the flood, doesn't mean what it says about animals were created, very separate, different, distinct kind of creatures. It doesn't mean what it says about death is here because of our actions. How would we expect the world to believe us when we start telling them about salvation and spiritual stuff? Because we don't even act like we believe it. This is huge. Now, last example. Okay, hang on just a second. I want to show you how easily we ourselves can be deceived with one more example, and then we're done. Now this is
The two ends obviously are parallel.
a little demonstration